I've got a fascinating story for you, all about a wild experiment from the early 1930s. A curious American psychologist, obsessed with human development, got really into these cases of feral children, kids raised by animals in the wild. He noticed these children often acted more like their animal caregivers than humans. This got him thinking, what if we flipped the script? What if we raised a wild animal, specifically a primate, like a human child? Enter Winthrop and Luella Kellogg. They were ready to take on this audacious plan. And lucky for them, they found the perfect subject at a primate research station in Florida, run by the famous primatologist Robert Yerkes. He agreed to let them have a 7.5-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua, who came from a colony in Havana. The Kellogg's own son, Donald, was 10 months old, making the age difference just a few months. This meant they could raise Gua and Donald side by side, under identical conditions. In the summer of 1931, the Kellogg's rented a house near Florida and started their preparations. The goal was to raise Gua as indistinguishably from a human baby as possible. By providing both babies with the same environmental stimuli, they aimed to observe Gua's potential for humanization, despite her nature, and the effects of a primate upbringing on Donald. This would help them determine whether behavior was more influenced by genetic inheritance or upbringing. They really wanted to see how human a chimp could become if treated exactly like a human, not just a pet. On June 26, 1931, Gua arrived and met 10-month-old Donald. The two scientists were incredibly excited. This was an unprecedented experiment, and their own child was a key participant. From day one, the Kellogg's treated Gua not like an animal, but like Donald's twin sister. Everything in the house was doubled. Little Gua wore human clothes and was treated as a human baby by everyone. Mornings began with both babies waking at the same time, getting their diapers changed, dressed, and eating breakfast. Gua sat in a high chair next to Donald, learning to hold her spoon and eat pureed breakfast. Surprisingly, she soon became much better at using a spoon and cup than Donald. While Donald struggled to hold his spoon properly, Gua skillfully used hers and drank from a cup without spilling. Evenings involved both getting into pajamas, being tucked into bed side by side, and receiving goodnight kisses. This wasn't just caring for a pet. Gua was genuinely being raised as a human. Gua was encouraged to wash her hands, start potty training, and play with dolls. Everyday human behaviors. Meanwhile, their son Donald, initially curious about his new furry sister, soon accepted her as a normal part of his life. His parents' equal affection for Gua made her a natural member of the family in Donald's eyes. The Kellogg's were careful to prevent jealousy, giving both equal attention, cuddling them at the same time, and playing with them together. As a result, Donald truly embraced Gua as his sister, and the human and chimpanzee infants began their shared upbringing. For the Kellogg's, every day was not just a parenting marathon, but also a scientific observation session. Winthrop Kellogg meticulously followed a daily schedule to maintain the experiment's seriousness. Gua and Donald were under observation for 12 hours a day, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. A corner of their house was practically a laboratory, complete with scales, measuring tapes, cards, toys, mirrors, and notebooks readily at hand. The children underwent tests for reflexes, depth perception, motor skills, and memory. In the initial months, Gua's performance was simply astonishing. It's well known that chimpanzees mature faster, and Gua was living proof. The little female chimp far surpassed her brother, Donald, in motor skills. When it came to trying to walk, crawling, running, holding onto things, and grasping objects, Gua was like a super-intelligent human child. Moreover, Gua's dexterity was remarkable. For instance, she figured out how to turn door handles and open doors before Donald did. She also learned to hold a cup with two hands, to drink water, and eat with a spoon, without spilling, all earlier than Donald. The Kellogg's were beaming with pride at these achievements. Even more striking was Gua's ability to imitate. Seeing Luella put the phone to her ear, Gua would mimic the action with a toy phone. Poor little Donald, on the other hand, was still babbling goo goo. Frankly, comparing a chimp infant and a human infant physically wasn't a fair fight. What was truly surprising was Gua's superior performance in human-like behaviors and commands. For example, when the Kellogg's told Donald to kiss, Gua would approach and gently kiss her brother's face. When told to wave goodbye, she could wave her hand up and down. She knew how to extend her hand for a handshake when asked. She even developed an understanding of 95 words and simple sentences, despite being 3 months younger than Donald and not even a year old yet. However, they also shared many similar behaviors. For instance, if her mother or father disappeared from view in the house, Gua would get weepy and whiny, just like Donald. This was a form of separation anxiety, not typical chimp behavior. Donald wasn't exhibiting monkey-like behavior yet, but it seemed Gua was well on her way to becoming quite human. Of course, Gua wasn't always a docile little lady, pulling at anything hanging. Curtains, tablecloths, her father's tie was one of Gua's favorite pastimes. But there were differences. Donald recognized people by their faces, while Gua recognized them by their clothes and scent. If someone she knew changed clothes, she could become wary of them. Donald's reactions were clearer and more consistent. Gua could also tell if her parents were in the room just by their scent, even with her eyes closed. As the experiment progressed, both babies continued to shine in their own ways, and for a long time, Gua seemed a step ahead. Gua was also the first to show interest in a picture book, turning the colorful pages and looking at the illustrations, while Donald was more inclined to put the book in his mouth. The Kellogg's meticulously noted these small details in their notebooks, but one detail would reveal the sharpest difference between the two. Gua was a chimpanzee, and naturally, she couldn't speak. The parts of the human brain responsible for speech are developed because we are human, but these areas are either underdeveloped or non-existent in apes. Coupled with vocal anatomical differences and minor genetic variations, it was highly unlikely Gua would ever speak. Donald, however, slowly started using words like mama and dada. No matter how hard the couple tried, or how much Gua tried to vocalize, she lacked these crucial structural differences present in humans. While the primary goal of the experiment wasn't language instruction, this linguistic gap would create a significant barrier in an experiment they planned to continue for 5 years. Gua was meant to stay with her human family until puberty, around 4 to 5 years old, and Donald would spend his childhood with Gua. However, problems began to emerge even before the first year was over. Gua seemed to have plateaued on her path to humanization. She acted as human as her body and brain allowed, but she couldn't progress beyond those limits. Language wasn't the only area where she started falling behind. For example, to reach a toy, Donald, with a little help, figured out how to pull a chair and climb on it, while Gua continued to rely on trial and error. The chimpanzee's capacity for adaptation couldn't match the human infant's. Chimpanzees reach puberty at 4 to 5 years old, while humans do so at 12 to 14. Thus, Gua developed rapidly in the early years and then plateaued, while the human child showed slower but more sustained development. Indeed, after 9 months, Gua seemed to have reached her clear limits in her journey of humanization. But this wasn't the real problem. This time, the other infant, Donald, began to drift away from being human. Perhaps the most striking outcome of the experiment came from a direction the Kellogg's hadn't anticipated. While Gua was adapting to her human family, Donald was adapting to his chimpanzee sister. Unexpectedly, little Donald began to take Gua as his role model. For instance, during his walking stage, Donald started moving around on all fours like Gua, instead of crawling. When Gua was put in her high chair because she was hungry, she would make excited chimpanzee sounds upon seeing food. After hearing his sister make these sounds repeatedly, Donald soon started making the same sounds when he was hungry or saw food. While the couple expected Gua to become human, their son Donald was slowly adopting chimpanzee behavior. Worse, Donald's language development, which should have been accelerating at this age, was instead leaning towards Gua's sounds rather than human language. His running, walking, reactions to excitement and fear, and even biting people when angry, were all imitative of Gua. This naturally began to alarm the research team, Donald's parents. Moreover, Gua was growing stronger. Chimpanzees possess strong muscles even as infants, but while her playful tugs and pushes were harmless when she was smaller, now, with her powerful muscles shaking, Donald looked more like a beating than a game. Of course, Gua's intention wasn't to harm her brother, but her seemingly harmless actions were quite taxing for Donald. Naturally, questions arose about what would happen in 3 or 5 months, or 2 years, if they continued the experiment. Consider this: a 4 to 5-year-old chimpanzee can easily lift a standard water dispenser, while a 5-year-old child of the same age and weight has virtually zero chance of doing so. This rapid physical development in chimps was incredibly powerful, and in later years, Gua could have easily overpowered Donald. This situation presented a tremendous risk and seemed to signal the experiment's inevitable end. The expectation was for Gua to slowly become more like Donald, perhaps acquiring some human traits. Instead, the opposite was partly happening. Furthermore, the physical risk was escalating to an unacceptable level. The couple genuinely loved Gua as their daughter, but it was clear they had been mistaken about her ability to change. Thus, the experiment was terminated on March 28, 1932, 4 years earlier than planned. Winthrop Kellogg noted in his diaries that the experiment ended because Gua had reached her human child limits, and Donald's language development was starting to be negatively affected. While the official statement didn't provide many details, it was clear that concerns about Donald's language delay played a major role in this decision. So, this extraordinary experiment, originally envisioned to last 5 years, ended after only 9 months. Of course, with the experiment's conclusion came the question of Gua's future. The little chimpanzee had to leave the Kellogg family. It was decided that Gua would be returned to the Yerkes Primate Center, where she was born. However, the Kellogg's didn't want to abandon Gua abruptly. She was like their daughter. Suddenly, separating her from her mother, father, and brother, and putting her in a cage would be traumatic for Gua. So, they planned a gradual separation. First, Gua would be taken to be with other chimps at the facility for a few hours a day, then brought home in the evening. During her time there, Gua naturally found her own species, whom she hadn't seen for a long time. Quite alien. Having been raised by humans, the behaviors and attitudes she encountered there were very different to her. What would happen if you put a human raised by monkeys into a house full of humans? It's pretty obvious. She hadn't seen them, nor had she developed her behaviors according to them. Afterward, she stayed at the center for a night or two before returning home. In the final stage, Gua was left completely at the center, and the Kellogg couple took Donald and left Florida for Indiana. This separation was incredibly sad for both Gua and the Kellogg family. Gua was separated from her mother for a second time. First, she had been separated from her real chimpanzee mother as a baby. Now, she was separated from Luella, whom she considered her human mother. She found herself behind bars, unable to understand why. Donald, naturally, missed his sister. Upon returning home, on the very first day, he made sounds as if calling Gua's name and crawled through the rooms searching for her. He hadn't even turned 2 yet and couldn't understand where his closest playmate had gone. Gua, too, spent days looking at the door, whimpering, seemingly waiting for her family to return. Of course, no one came or went. The experiment had ended, but both Donald's and Gua's lives had been profoundly changed, and both their lives would sadly progress and end tragically. A book emerged after the experiment, which was widely discussed in the scientific community. Ethical debates and such followed, and it eventually faded from memory. Gua adjusted to her new environment and her own kind after the separation. The traumatic effects of the separation lingered, but she adapted somehow. However, her life life wouldn't be very long. At the age of 3, 2 years after the experiment, she contracted pneumonia and died. Donald's situation was a bit more controversial. Initially, his language development was quite poor, but after Gua left, he recovered and adapted to human life. On the surface, the experiment didn't cause him lasting harm. In fact, in later years, he had a successful education and became a doctor. However, he sadly took his own life in 1973 at the age of 43. It's unknown whether this tragedy had any connection to his childhood experience. He had lost both his parents a year before this and likely experienced personal depressions triggered by their deaths. Still, for those who know the story of Gua and Donald, it's a curious coincidence that both siblings' lives ended in tragedy. For the first time, a human and a primate infant were raised side by side in a controlled manner and systematically compared. Gua gained skills she would never have acquired in a natural primate environment, exhibiting human-like behaviors in a loving home. But on the other hand, it also proved that genetic boundaries couldn't be crossed. She never spoke and couldn't surpass a certain intelligence threshold. Donald, meanwhile, demonstrated how susceptible even humans are to environmental influences at a very young age. If they had stayed together a little longer, things could have gotten even more interesting. But then, the experiment might not have ended so peacefully. That's all from me this week. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please remember that I do all the work on this channel by myself, and I can only keep it going with your likes and comments.